3,472 consecutive nights. That's how long Sarah Chen had moved through the fluorescent corridors of Oak Creek Memorial without being truly seen. The night shift was a kingdom of invisibility, a place where the quiet ones could work without questions, without attention, without anyone asking what hands steady enough to hold a beating heart were doing beneath a nurse's scrubs. She arrived at 2,247 hours, exactly 13 minutes before her shift started, the same routine she'd maintained for 7 years. The parking lot still held the smell of Norfolk rain mixed with diesel from the delivery trucks. Her scrubs were navy blue, unmarked, generic enough that she could vanish into any hospital hallway in America. That was intentional. Everything about Sarah Chen was intentional. Oak Creek Memorial hummed its midnight frequency as she entered through the ambulance bay. The emergency department was controlled chaos, 3 trauma bays occupied, a waiting room with the usual parade of insomnia and desperation, and the kind of exhaustion that hung in the air like humidity. She clocked in at 2,300 exactly, her employee badge reading Sarah Chen, RN, night shift, with a photo that showed someone who could have been anyone's forgotten coworker. The locker room was empty. She placed her bag on the metal bench and opened her assigned locker, number 47, a number she'd never changed in 7 years because changing things created patterns that people noticed. Inside hung her extra scrubs, still folded from the hospital laundry service. Behind them, tucked against the locker's back wall, sat 3 items. A cracked ceramic mug from a dive bar in San Diego that closed 8 years ago. A dying succulent in a plastic pot that had somehow survived longer than anything else in her life. And a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling, showing 12 men in dress white standing in front of a helicopter. 6 of those men had names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial now. The other 6 had names on the walls of Arlington. She never looked at the photo. She always looked at the photo. Sarah closed the locker and moved into the hospital proper. The night shift was where she existed best, where fluorescent lights replaced sunlight, where the world operated in increments measured by monitors and vital signs, where speaking wasn't required and silence was respected. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed with burnt coffee from the nursing station as she approached her assignment board. 23 patients. 3 post-surgical recoveries. 1 trauma observation. 2 ICU rotations. And room 347, Marcus Webb, deaf veteran, post-op day 2, spinal fusion recovery, stable vitals. She moved through the first 3 hours with the invisible efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that survival meant not being remarkable. Checking vitals. Documenting findings. Adjusting for rates. Communicating through the intercom when necessary. Her handwriting was precise, medical terminology flowing across the electronic charts with the muscle memory of someone who'd written thousands of surgical notes. The tremor in her left hand appeared during quiet moments, a ghost of shrapnel lodged too close to nerve endings to be safely extracted, but it vanished the instant she touched a patient. Her hands became instruments. Steady. Sure. Incapable of doubt. Room 347 was at the end of the west corridor, past the pharmacy window and the supply room where fluorescent lights buzzed like insects. Sarah knocked twice and entered. Marcus Webb lay propped at a 30-degree angle, his surgical site dressed cleanly, monitors displaying the comfortable rhythm of post-operative recovery. He was awake, watching the ceiling with the distant focus of someone accustomed to silence. His chart read 34 years old, retired Special Forces, spinal injury from a 2019 IED explosion in Kandahar province that had cost him his hearing but not his life. The spine fusion was elective, corrective surgery, something he delayed for 5 years before finally agreeing to the procedure. Sarah didn't introduce herself verbally. She moved to the 4 line, checking the flow rate, her movements deliberate and visible. When Marcus turned his head toward her, she made eye contact and signed, 2 hands moving in patterns that came from somewhere deep in her muscle memory, somewhere from before she had a name like Sarah Chen. Sleep well. Rest easy. The phrases were automatic, muscle memory from a place and time she'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Marcus's expression changed, a subtle shift in his eyes, something that looked like recognition but couldn't possibly be recognition. How would he know? How could he possibly know that the night nurse checking his for was the woman who'd pulled him from a collapsed concrete wall in Helmand Province 2 decades ago, a terrified 8-year-old boy buried in dust, whose life she'd held in her hands while incoming fire punched through the compound walls? He signed back, "Thank you." She nodded, documented his vitals, adjusted his pain medication, and left the room. 31 minutes until the next vital check. The pattern was rhythmic, predictable, safe. The nursing station occupied a central hub on the floor, 6 computer terminals arranged in a hexagon with 4 chairs occupied by the night shift nurses, Sarah, 2 others she'd worked with for years without friendship, and the charge nurse, Jennifer, who'd learned never to ask Sarah personal questions. The station hummed with the ambient sound of mechanical keyboards and the low murmur of monitors beeping in distant rooms. At 03 for 7 hours, the hospital reached that peculiar depth of night where time seemed suspended, where the world outside the building had effectively ceased to exist. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0415, which was unusual. Attending physicians typically didn't make rounds before 0600. His shoes announced him before anything else, expensive Italian leather, hand-polished, clicking against the linoleum tile with a rhythm that made Sarah's jaw tighten by 1 millimeter. She continued typing her notes on the post-op patient in room 344, a woman whose surgical site was healing normally, whose pain levels were well controlled, whose discharge was already being planned despite Sterling having ordered 3 additional diagnostic tests yesterday. Tests the chart didn't support. Tests that would generate additional billing codes. "Morning, ladies." Sterling's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a position of authority. He was tall, early 50s, with the kind of appearance that made people want to trust him, silver-threaded hair, a tailored coat, eyes that seemed to see through people rather than at them. "Night shift treating you well?" "All stable," Jennifer answered from her terminal. Sterling moved toward the medication dispensary, but his path took him past Sarah's workstation. He paused. His eyes caught on the notes she'd been typing, reading her documentation on the medication orders he'd placed. Sarah continued typing, her fingers moving with mechanical precision, not breaking rhythm. The tremor in her left hand had vanished the moment he entered the room. It always did. Composure was a weapon she'd learned to use before she could read. "You know," Sterling said, his voice casual in a way that made every nurse at the station immediately tense, "I was speaking with some of my colleagues this morning. We were discussing the night shift. Making observations about turnover rates." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "And I made a bet. I said the quiet one here," he gestured vaguely toward Sarah without looking at her. "I said she'll quit within a week. Bet $50 she doesn't have the resilience for this place." No one responded. The typing continued. The monitors beat their steady rhythm in the darkness beyond the station. "Anyone want to take that bet?" Sterling smiled, the expression carrying teeth. $50 says your quiet little night nurse breaks first." Sarah's fingers continued their mechanical movement across the keyboard. Documentation of Dr. Sterling's post-op patient, room 344, patient reports pain 3/10. Surgical site clean, no erythema or discharge. Vitals stable. Patient mobile to bathroom with assistance. For line patent, no signs of infiltration. Recommend continued current medication protocol. Each word was precise. Each observation accurate. Each notation a small, careful flag that the additional tests he'd ordered were not supported by clinical findings. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Jennifer changed the subject by asking about a patient in the ICU, and Sterling eventually moved away from the station toward the medication dispensary. Sarah's fingers continued typing. Her expression remained unchanged. The tremor did not return. The night stretched forward in its normal rhythm, checks and documentation, vitals and assessments, the invisible work of someone who'd learned that the most dangerous people were always the quiet ones. But Sterling had seen something in those notes. Something in the precision of her charting that had made his jaw tighten, had made him decide in that moment that this particular quiet nurse was going to be a problem. He just didn't know yet how much of a problem she would become. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial during shift change was a collision of white coats and exhaustion, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Dr. Sterling stood near the coffee station, voice carrying across 3 tables with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'll bet anyone here $50 that our quiet little night nurse quits within a week. These agency temps never last once they realize this isn't some charity clinic." The other attendings laughed, the kind of laughter that requires an audience to feel complete. Sarah pushed through the double doors carrying her breakfast tray, and she didn't see Sterling move into her path because she was thinking about Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation numbers from rounds, the slight asymmetry in his chest expansion that had registered as a note in her charts. The collision happened exactly as Sterling planned it. His shoulder caught the corner of her tray, not quite gently, and physics did the rest. The oatmeal container flew upward, coffee arcing through the air like a brown ribbon, and both hit the tile floor with the sharp percussion of a dropped instrument tray. The sound made every head in the cafeteria turn. Oatmeal spread across white tiles in a slow bloom. Coffee pooled and began running toward the drain. Sarah stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds, watching the mess expand, then knelt to retrieve the pieces, a practice motion, economical, the way someone moves who has learned that efficiency is survival. The tray. The bowl. The spoon. Her movements were methodical, unhurried, while Sterling stood above her, arms crossed, watching. "Careful there, sweetheart, you're as clumsy with trays as you are with patient notes." He said it loud enough for the room to hear, and the attendings exchanged glances. The words were meant to land like a punch, to make her flinch, to break something inside her that would make her easier to remove. Sarah picked up the last piece of debris and stood, the tray held level, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. A single tear escaped, genuine, unexpected, the kind that comes from pressure rather than emotion, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact, her voice dropping to a register that somehow filled the entire cafeteria. A man who needs to humiliate others is already defeated. He just doesn't know it yet. The silence was absolute. Sterling's jaw tightened. He'd expected submission or anger or tears, something he could point to as evidence of instability. What he got instead was a reflection, and he didn't like what he saw in it. He turned away, but his hands clenched into fists as he walked back to his table. The attendings returned to their conversations, quieter now, the rhythm disrupted. Sterling spent the next 2 days building his case. He reviewed her charts with a neurosurgeon from Columbia and a billing auditor from Connecticut, circling her questions about post-operative equipment orders. He called Richard Voss at Med Supply Solutions from his car in the parking garage, accepting an envelope containing $12,000 in exchange for more thoracic drainage systems that 3 of his patients didn't clinically require. The money went into a separate account under his business partner's name. The equipment orders went through within hours. Sarah documented everything. 3 patients with thoracic procedures but no clinical indicators for drainage system placement. 5 post-op imaging reports that contradicted Sterling's surgical notes. 1 patient who'd received a $48,000 equipment order for a condition that resolved without intervention. Her charting was precise, quotable, a paper trail that would survive any audit. Sterling knew it the moment he saw her shift note on Marcus Webb's file. O2 sat trending lower than expected for post-operative day 3. Recommend additional imaging. Chest symmetry asymmetrical. Monitoring for pneumothorax. She was looking. Really looking. In 6 weeks, her documentation would be sufficient to trigger an insurance audit. In 8 weeks, it would reach the Joint Commission. In 12 weeks, it would be federal. He called Douglas Hartwell, the hospital board chairman, from his personal cell at 7 in the morning, knowing Hartwell would be on the golf course. "We have a problem. One of the night nurses. She's asking questions about equipment orders, documenting things that aren't relevant, trying to make my clinical decisions look questionable. I need her gone, but it has to be clean." Hartwell's response came without hesitation: document everything. Build a case. We'll handle it through proper channels. The next morning, Sterling brought the dismissal consultant into his office and handed her a folder. Inside were Sarah's shift notes, marked with red tabs. I need you to review her charting practices. I'm concerned about scope creep and insubordination. The consultant, a woman with the efficient bearing of someone who'd destroyed careers before, nodded and made her first notation: excessive documentation beyond nursing scope. Sterling contacted the temp agency Sarah had used to secure employment without triggering a full background check. He requested her employment history, her previous references, any documentation of performance issues. He opened a disciplinary file labeled Pattern of Insubordination and began adding entries: question surgical decision regarding post-operative monitoring, 11/14. Made critical comment to senior physician, 11/16. Excessive notation in patient charts, ongoing. Each entry was technically true but contextually distorted, like a photograph taken at exactly the wrong angle. Sarah noticed none of this. She was focused on Marcus Webb, whose oxygen saturation had been declining steadily throughout the afternoon. She'd checked it at 1,600, 93%. At 1,800, 90%. At 2,000, 88%. His chest rise was asymmetrical, his breathing pattern shallow despite the oxygen he was receiving. She pressed the call button for the on-call resident, a young physician named Dr. Reeves who she'd worked with before. His voice came through the intercom. Tired, what do you need? Room 347. Webb. O2 sat dropping, asymmetrical chest movement. I'm in the ER with a level 1 trauma. Can you monitor him? I'll be up in 30. 30 minutes was 30 minutes too long. Sarah could feel it in the way Marcus's breathing had changed, the slight rasp at the end of each exhale, the way his shoulders were rising to compensate for the work his lungs were no longer doing. She'd seen this pattern before, in different locations, in different wars, in the spaces between life and clinical death. She was already moving toward his room when the monitor alarm began to sound, a series of high-pitched beeps that made her walk faster, that made her skip the next breath in her own chest. What happened next changed everything. The monitor alarm screamed at 2:47 in the morning. 3 short bursts, then silence, then 3 more. The sound cut through the fluorescent hum like a scalpel through tissue. Sarah's head snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been documenting vitals, her body already moving before her conscious mind registered which room. Room 347. Marcus Webb. She took the corridor in 4 strides, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the linoleum, muscle memory from 2 decades of controlled urgency propelling her forward. The night shift was skeletal, only 2 other nurses on the entire floor, one of them already occupied with a post-op patient 3 rooms down. No attending physician. No backup except whoever answered the call light. She pushed into the room and the crisis was immediate, undeniable. Marcus sat upright in bed, his body rigid, panic flooding his face in a way that transcended his inability to hear. His chest was moving wrong. The right side expanded while the left remained still, a grotesque asymmetry that made every cell in Sarah's body recognize the diagnosis before her rational brain could catalogue the symptoms. His neck veins bulged like dark cords beneath his skin, distended and pulsing. His trachea, she could see the deviation from the doorway, shifted left, pushed there by pressure that was mounting inside his chest cavity with every breath he fought to take. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung filling the space with it that had nowhere to escape, building pressure that would kill him in minutes if the pressure wasn't released. Not hours. Minutes. His oxygen saturation was 84% and dropping. She watched it fall as she moved, 82, 80, 78. His lips were already taking on the grayish tint of oxygen starvation. Sarah crossed to the bed in 3 steps. Marcus. Look at me. Her voice was level, steady as a surgical laser. He locked eyes with her, and she could see the animal fear there, the primal understanding that his body was betraying him. I'm going to help you. You're safe. She didn't have time to wait for the on-call resident. She didn't have time for the attending. She had maybe 90 seconds before his blood pressure collapsed, before his heart began to compensate in ways that would lead to cardiac arrest. Her hands moved to the crash cart in the corner of the room, muscle memory taking the wheel. 14-gauge needle. The largest bore that would fit through the chest wall. She could see it in her mind's eye before she pulled it from its packaging, the same needle she'd used 20 years ago in the dust and chaos of Helmand Province, the same tool she'd wielded in a collapsed compound while rounds sparked off the rubble. Pain is information. Blood is data. Action is survival. She prepped his right chest at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmark where the needle would slip through the intercostal muscles, through the parietal pleura, into the space where a lung that should have been breathing was collapsed and useless. His skin was cool under her fingers, fierce sweat already dampening the hospital gown. Deep breath. She didn't wait. She couldn't afford to wait. The needle went in. For a moment, one suspended, eternal moment, nothing happened. Then the hiss. The sharp, unmistakable sound of pressurized air rushing out through the needle, the sound of equilibrium being restored, the sound of a life being pulled back from the edge. Like a tire deflating. Like pressure being released from a sealed container. Like the moment a patient's chest stops fighting to expand. "Get me a chest tube tray," Sarah said to the empty air, but Dr. Park was already there in the doorway, the on-call resident who'd been called by a nurse following protocol. He was staring at her, at Marcus, at the needle, his mouth open. "I need the tray. Now." Not a question. Not a request. A command that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from the part of her that had led men through darkness and brought them home. Dr. Park moved. He was moving before he knew why, responding to a tone of voice that transcended rank and protocol. He was back in 30 seconds with the tray, tubing, local anesthetic, the larger chest tube itself, the Heimlich valve that would let fluid and air escape while preventing them from flowing back into the cavity. Sarah's fingers worked with the precision of someone who had done this under fire, who had done this with shrapnel falling and IED dust still settling. She numbed the site with lidocaine. She made the small incision in the fourth intercostal space, just below the existing puncture. She slipped the chest tube through, felt the subtle give as it entered the pleural cavity, heard the wet sucking sound as it started draining the air that had been crushing his lung. Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed. 86. 89. 92. The numbers on the monitor climbing like a prayer being answered. Color returned to his face in real time, the gray fading to a more normal tan. His breathing slowed from the panic gasping to something more controlled, more human. She secured the tube with sutures and tape, her movements economical and certain, and only when Marcus's eyes began to close, the sedation the 4 medications providing, did she step back and allow herself to notice that Dr. Park was shaking, that his hand was covering his mouth. "Get respiratory in here," she said to him. "Tell them we have a needle decompression with chest tube placement in room 347. Pneumothorax. Right side. Notify the attending." She was checking Marcus's pupils, assessing his level of consciousness, when his service dog handler appeared in the doorway. The woman had been waiting in the visitor's chair down the hall, sleeping fitfully in case Marcus needed her. Her German shepherd, Ranger, stood beside her, alert even at this hour. Sarah moved to the monitors, documenting, creating the clinical record that would explain what had happened and why. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She felt the absence of tremor in her fingers like a point of pride. That was when Marcus's fingers moved. Still under sedation, still barely conscious, he was signing. Not to anyone in particular. Not to the handler or to Sarah or to the monitors. His hands moved in the near dark of the room, fingers spelling out words with the desperate clarity of someone surfacing from deep water. Sarah watched the signs. Helmand. Mine. Before. She. Saved. The handler was watching too, trying to record the signs on her phone, confused by the specificity of a place name, by the emotion radiating from her patient despite the medication pulling him under. The door was opening behind Sarah. She could hear the footsteps before she saw him. Dr. Sterling. Of course. A nurse would have called, would have followed protocol, would have reported the incident immediately to the surgical attending. He took in the scene in a single glance, the chest tube secured and draining, marker sedated and stabilizing, the monitors showing normal ranges now instead of the critical values they'd been showing minutes before. His eyes moved across the equipment, the supplies, the evidence of intervention, and his expression shifted. First to something that might have been relief. Then to something colder. Something calculating. "What exactly did you just do, Ms. Chen?" His voice was silk over steel, the tone he used when he was about to make a command decision. Sarah turned to face him, her hand still visible, her face composed. Tension pneumothorax. Tracheal deviation, jugular distension, asymmetrical chest expansion. Oxygen saturation dropping below 80%. I performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, followed by emergency chest tube placement. Each sentence was factual. Each sentence was clinical. Each sentence was the truth. Without physician authorization, Sterling said. Without time to wait for authorization, Dr. Park started, his voice shaky. "She saved his." Sterling's hand rose like a knife cutting. "That's not your assessment to make, Doctor." He didn't look at Park. He was watching Sarah, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. She could see him weighing options, considering angles. "I want a complete incident report. Documentation of the procedure, the clinical indicators, the timeline. Everything." "It's already being recorded," Sarah said. She gestured to the monitor, to the automatic vital sign recordings that captured timestamps, to the evidence embedded in the system itself. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to the charge nurse who had appeared in the doorway behind him, already preparing for the morning shift change. "Get a formal statement from Ms. Chen about this incident. I want to review it before anyone else does." The nurse nodded, understanding the subtext, understanding that something had shifted. That a line had been crossed. That the game that had been playing out between Sterling and Sarah for the past week had just moved into territory that demanded documentation, that demanded witnesses, that demanded a paper trail that couldn't be erased with a casual insult in the cafeteria. Sarah was still standing beside Marcus's bed, her hand steady, her breathing controlled. The monitors around her hummed their steady reassurance. The chest tube drained dark fluid into its collection chamber, old blood and air and the evidence of the trauma the pneumothorax had inflicted. Marcus's oxygen saturation held at 93%, climbing slowly as his lungs re-expanded. She'd done exactly what she was trained to do. She'd identified a life-threatening emergency. She'd intervened with precision and speed. She'd saved a patient in critical condition. And in doing so, she'd made Dr. Sterling's calculated campaign of humiliation and pressure look exactly like what it was, a petty vendetta against a nurse who was better at medicine than he would ever be. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, unwavering hum. Outside the room, the hospital began its slow shift toward morning. In the distance, she could hear another siren approaching, the next emergency, the next patient, the next crisis. Sarah checked Marcus's sedation one more time, confirmed his breathing, and stepped out of the room into the hallway. That was when the real complications began. Dr. Sterling pushed through the doorway of room 347 with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned, never been wrong, never faced consequences that mattered. Marcus lay sedated but breathing, chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, oxygen saturation climbing steadily on the monitor, a man pulled back from the edge of oblivion. Sarah stood at the monitor station, her hand steady, her eyes forward, the tremor already fading from her shoulders like a storm moving inland. Sterling's gaze swept the room. The chest tube was placed perfectly. The needle decompression site was clean. Everything about the intervention screamed competence, which was precisely the problem. He moved closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to that particular register he used when delivering punishment disguised as professionalism. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. That's well beyond your scope. That's a termination event." His eyes were flat, satisfied, a predator recognizing wounded prey. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked back out, already reaching for his phone. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless fluorescent song. Sarah's shoulders dropped exactly 1 inch. She understood what was coming. She'd seen enough institutional machinery in her life to recognize the precise moment when gears began to turn. By 2:33 a.m., Sterling sat in his home office with the morning golf tournament schedule pulled up on his laptop. Douglas Hartwell, the hospital board chairman, was a creature of habit. Tuesday mornings at Cedarbrook Country Club, 7:22 a.m. tea time without fail, a man who checked his phone precisely once per hole. Sterling knew him well enough to know that a call at 6:15 a.m., before Hartwell even left his house, would register as an emergency. He was right. Hartwell picked up on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. Sterling delivered his narrative with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. The night shift nurse performed a needle decompression without authorization. Unauthorized procedure. Liability exposure. We need immediate termination processed before day shift takes over, or the hospital faces civil action. He paused, letting silence do its work. I'm prepared to document everything. Hartwell was awake now. How serious? She could have killed him. The fact that he survived doesn't change the recklessness. Hartwell agreed before Sterling even finished talking. The chairman had his own problems, a pending audit, 3 malpractice suits in discovery, quarterly metrics that looked worse every quarter. One terminated nurse was a simple solution. I'll have HR prepare the termination letter. You're sure about this? Completely sure. By 6:24 a.m., Sterling was on the phone with Northgate Staffing, the temp agency that had placed Sarah. He identified himself as Dr. Sterling, Chief of Surgery, voice carrying the kind of weight that made administrative staff sit straighter at their desks. I need complete background verification on Sarah Chen. Employment history. References. I need to know about any gaps in her work history, any prior allegations, anything that raised flags. The staffing coordinator was already typing. Sterling continued, his tone casual, lethal. We're conducting a full scope of practice review. Standard procedure. I'm sure you understand the liability implications. He understood. Everyone understood. A nurse with a questionable background in a termination proceeding meant the hospital's legal position strengthened exponentially. The staffing coordinator promised a full packet by end of business. Sterling thanked him and hung up. By 6:24 a.m., Dr. Marianne Foster sat across from Sterling in his office with a cup of coffee and a box containing every chart Sarah had ever touched at Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Foster was a medical investigator who specialized in nursing malpractice cases, the kind of doctor who made her living proving that nurses had overstepped, mischarted, or endangered patients. She was very good at her job. She'd be very good at this job. Sterling handed her 3 folders. I need a preliminary report by end of business. Focus on any instances where her documentation contradicts physician orders, any pattern of questioning medical decisions, any procedures she assisted with that seem outside standard nursing protocol. Foster opened the first chart, already making notes. She didn't look up. How confident are you? Completely. By 7:15 a.m., Sterling had his termination letter drafted. It was a masterpiece of institutional language, unauthorized scope of practice, patient safety concerns, breach of hospital protocol, each phrase a brick in an unassailable wall. He printed it, signed it with a fountain pen that cost more than Sarah made in a week, and placed it in a manila envelope that security would deliver. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled against his chin, and allowed himself a smile that would have looked perfectly natural to anyone passing his office, satisfied, professional, certain. At 7:33 a.m., the page went out to security, escort Sarah Chen from the premises. Immediate termination. She's to collect personal items from her locker, nothing else, and be off hospital property within 15 minutes. Security moved fast. They always moved fast for terminations. There was science to it, get the person out before the shock wore off, before they thought to call a lawyer, before the story had time to spread through the grapevine and transform into something that looked like a vendetta. Sarah was completing her final charting when the 2 security guards approached the nursing station. Both of them looked uncomfortable, they'd worked nights with her, knew her competence, her quiet professionalism, the way she'd helped them carry a coding patient once when there weren't enough hands. One of them spoke, "Ms. Chen, we need you to come with us." The nursing station went silent. Not a subtle silence. A complete absence of sound, like the world had held its breath and forgotten to exhale. Sarah looked up from her keyboard. She read their expressions in approximately 2 seconds and understood everything. She closed her computer, gathered her things, and stood with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she'd been standing up from bad news for quite a long time. They walked her to her locker in the staff break room, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made human skin look cadaverous. Sarah opened her locker door. The cracked mug sat on the top shelf, the one that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. The dying succulent that had been slowly withering for 3 months. The photograph, face down, the one she hadn't looked at in 2 years, her SEAL team, Charlie Platoon, 2003. 17 of them in the picture. 4 of them came home. 3 of those for no longer served. Only she and 1 other had stayed in silence, kept working, kept breathing. She placed each item in the cardboard box the security guard offered her. The mug made a soft clink. The succulent's terracotta pot settled against the bottom. The photograph, still face down, landed on top. She could feel the weight of those faces through the cardboard, through the years, through the entire architecture of lies she'd constructed to survive this long. They walked her back through the hospital corridors at 7:45 a.m., just as the day shift was arriving, just as the incoming staff was taking reports and checking labs and settling into their routines. The walk was approximately 80 meters. It felt like 80 miles. Eyes averted. Conversation stopped. Whispers started. By the time they reached the lobby, everyone knew. By the time they reached the parking lot, the story was already transforming. She'd made a mistake in surgery, she'd been stealing, she'd been incompetent, take your pick. Through the glass doors, Norfolk was raining. Not delicate rain. Hard rain, the kind that came up from the Atlantic in grey sheets, the kind that made the world look like it was dissolving. Sarah stood at the bus stop 3 blocks away, the cardboard box held against her chest because she had no other hands to carry it, because the plastic handles would have cut into her palms if she'd used them. Water dripped from her hair, soaked the cardboard, began to seep through to the photograph inside. The sun was rising somewhere behind the clouds, but you couldn't see it, just a lightening of the grey, a suggestion that dawn was happening whether anyone could perceive it or not. She was standing in her scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and patient care and the particular exhaustion that came from saving a life that had already been decided, in some cosmic calculus, to be saved. Or maybe to be lost. She still didn't know which. 20 years. 20 years of walking through hospitals in this country with a false social security number, false references, a false employment history, a false name in every database that mattered. 20 years of building a small quiet life where no one knew who she'd been or what she'd done or what she'd left behind. Gone. All of it, dissolved like the cardboard in this Norfolk rain, like her carefully constructed identity was made of nothing more substantial than smoke and prayer. She had no family who knew where she was. She'd walked away from the military without forwarding address, without contact information, without any thread connecting her to the woman she'd been. The few people who'd known the truth had either died in combat or moved on to other lives where they didn't speak about the ghost medic, the woman who appeared where the fighting was worst and disappeared before anyone could thank her. She'd wanted invisibility. She'd earned it. And now invisibility felt like drowning. The rain tasted like tears and failure and the particular bitterness of a woman realizing that her strategy had been fundamentally flawed, that hiding didn't protect you, it just delayed the moment when everything collapsed at once. The cardboard box was coming apart. The photograph was getting soaked. She could feel the ink beginning to run, the faces beginning to blur, turning abstract and watercolor and unreal. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb Service dog handler, a woman named Lieutenant Diana Reeves who worked for a private security firm specializing in military transitions, had spent 18 hours reviewing those fragmented signs. Helmand saved me, before cross-referencing them against every after-action report from Helmand Province in 2003, narrowing it down through classified databases she still had access to, until she found the reference to Operation Sanctuary Ridge and the female Navy SEAL medic who'd rescued an 8-year-old Afghan boy during a 6-hour firefight in Sanjin Valley. She'd found a name. She'd found a face. She'd found a woman who'd disappeared completely after 2004, who shouldn't exist in any database, who had somehow resurfaced in Norfolk, Virginia, working night shifts at a hospital, asking no questions, expecting no recognition. Diana Reeves had made phone calls. Important phone calls. The kind of calls that reach people who could reach other people, who could reach the people who'd served alongside Sarah, who'd lost brothers because Sarah had worked miracles in the dark. Those phones started ringing at approximately 8:11 p.m., 18 hours after Sarah was escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial in the rain, still bleeding out her identity onto cardboard in the cold Norfolk dawn. 18 hours after Sarah Chen stood in the rain with a cardboard box containing her entire military history, the phone started ringing in quiet offices across the country. The kind of calls that didn't go through switchboards or appear on caller ID. The kind that reached people who could reach other people, who could reach the people who'd served alongside a woman named Chen, who'd lost brothers because Sarah had worked miracles in Helmand Province while rounds of ammunition carved the dust around her. At 8:56 p.m. Norfolk time, a former Taliban fighter named Rashid Ahmadi arrived at Oak Creek Memorial's emergency bay with a gunshot wound to the left shoulder and a fever that climbed past 104 degrees. The wound was 3 days old, infected, septic. He was delirious when the nurses wheeled him past the lobby with its wall of staff photographs, the same wall where Sarah's photo hung beneath her name. Ahmadi's eyes locked on that photograph the way a man locks on a compass when he's lost in the dark. His handler, a federal agent named Martinez standing beside the gurney, asked him who he was looking at. Ahmadi's voice came out in Pashto, then broken English, "That woman. The ghost medic. She held our village for 6 hours. 6 hours. While we had numbers and ammunition and rage, she held a line with nothing but training and will." The words came slow, certain. "I was there. I was one of them trying to breach that compound. I've carried that day for 20 years. Martinez's hand moved to his phone. He made a call that reached someone in Norfolk who reached someone else. By 9:15 p.m., 3 FBI agents were walking through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors with warrants that felt like ice water in everyone's veins. By midnight, room 347 was no longer a patient's private space. It was something else entirely. The door stood open at precisely 6:27 a.m. when the sun crested the Norfolk skyline and turned the hospital's east wing the color of burnt copper. 12 Special Forces operators in full dress uniform, dress blues with ribbons spanning their chests like medals of war itself, stood at rigid attention on either side of Marcus Webb's hospital bed. Their boots reflected the fluorescent lights with the kind of shine that comes from ritual and respect. The unit patches on their shoulders read, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, Naval Special Warfare Command. One of them held a folder. Another stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Marcus sat up in bed, his spinal fusion still tender but his eyes alert, moving with the precision of someone who understood what this moment meant. A military interpreter stood at his left side, hands ready for sign language. Marcus's fingers began to move. The interpreter's voice came clear across the silent room. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen saved my life when I was 8 years old. In Helmand Province. In a collapsed building. During Operation Sanctuary Ridge. I didn't remember her face for 20 years. But my body remembered. My hands remembered. My survival instinct remembered the hands that pulled me from that rubble. Each word landed like a revelation. The nurses standing in the doorway behind the operators stopped breathing. A monitor beeped somewhere. Marcus continued, his hands speaking with the fluency of someone who'd learned that silence was a weapon and communication was a choice. That woman was fired yesterday for saving my life. For doing what I'm now trained to do. For being what I now am. She was punished for excellence. The interpreter's voice cracked slightly on that last sentence, which meant Marcus's signing had carried an emotion so raw that even translation struggled to contain it. A SEAL team commander stepped forward. His name tag read Commander James Holloway, and his chest bore the weight of a man who'd given orders in places where orders meant life or death. His voice came low, measured, the kind of voice that doesn't need to rise because everyone is already listening with every cell of their body. "I'm going to tell you who that woman is." He opened the folder. The room's air pressure seemed to shift. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEAL Teams, retired medical specialist. The first word landed. Sarah's Navy Cross citation. The interpreter read aloud, "For extraordinary heroism in combat operations." Holloway's eyes moved across the page. Bronze Star. He paused. The room held. Silver Star. Second engagement, Helmand Province, 2006. Pause. Another Silver Star. Helmand Province, 2008. The silence stretched. Purple Heart. March 2009. IED strike, Kandahar Province. Another pause. The rituals of respect require space between honors. A second Purple Heart. July 2009. Each medal became its own sentence, its own breath, its own moment of recognition that the quiet woman in scrubs was something the hospital had never understood. Holloway's jaw tightened. He reached the end of the folder. His voice dropped another octave, the kind of quiet that fills entire rooms. "And a Navy Cross." The room stopped. No one moved. No sound except the mechanical breath of the hospital itself, ventilators, monitors, the low hum of machines that keep people alive. Holloway continued, 47 combat medical evacuations under fire. 17 documented saves of children in active war zones. Not counting Marcus here, who makes 18. An FBI agent appeared in the doorway behind the SEAL operators, moving with the kind of purpose that ends conversations. He carried a warrant sealed with the weight of federal authority. He moved directly toward the stairs, another agent peeling off toward the administrative offices. The third agent entered Dr. Sterling's office at 7:02 a.m. without knocking. Sterling was reviewing a new contract with an equipment supplier, his third cup of coffee still steaming, his phone dark because no one was calling anymore. The agency had a certain elegance. They didn't arrest him in front of the staff. They didn't make him a martyr. They made him irrelevant. The agent placed the warrant on his mahogany desk. "Dr. Marcus Sterling, we have a federal warrant to seize your computer, your phone records, and your personal files as evidence of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and retaliation against a protected witness." Sterling's hands began to shake. Not from fear. From the recognition that the walls he'd built, the network he'd spent years constructing, had already crumbled while he was still sitting in his chair. His calls to Douglas Hartwell, the board chairman, had been documented by federal wiretap. His request for Sarah's background information through the temp agency was now evidence of retaliation against a whistleblower. The unnecessary thoracic drainage systems he'd ordered from MedSupply Solutions, $847,000 in overcharges across 187 patients, were all in emails that he thought were secure. But federal agents don't work with assumptions. They work with certainty. By 11:02 a.m., Richard Voss from MedSupply Solutions was arrested at Norfolk International Airport, his passport flagged, his suitcase containing $240,000 in cash seized by customs. By noon, Hartwell released a statement through his attorney, "I had no knowledge of any irregularities and am resigning from the hospital board effective immediately." By 1:53 p.m., Patricia Crane, the chief nursing officer who'd approved Sterling's request to terminate Sarah, was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By 2:15 p.m., hospital security approached Dr. Sterling in the physician's lounge. Not to protect him. To escort him out. The guard was the same one who'd handed Sarah her cardboard box the day before. His name was Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, but he didn't need to be. He understood the weight of that particular box. Sterling stood when he saw them come, his face already the color of something dying. The guard's voice came flat, professional, devoid of anything resembling sympathy. "You'll need to pack your office." Now. The walk through the hospital's corridors was conducted in silence so complete that it became a public reckoning. Nurses and residents lined the hallways. No one looked away this time. The chart-throwing doctor, the man who'd made a public bet that a woman would quit, the man who'd orchestrated her firing using his network of allies, now those same allies were either resigning, being arrested, or lawyering up. Sterling's hands trembled as he threw his diplomas into the cardboard box. His framed awards went next. The expensive pen set, the Rolex watch he'd bought with kickback money, the photograph of him at some gala with Hartwell. Everything went into the box with the sound of things breaking even when they didn't. The FBI agents took photographs of every item before it was packed, cataloging the evidence of his office's emptiness. By the time he reached the front entrance, rain was falling again, the same rain that had fallen on Sarah's cardboard box the day before, the kind of Norfolk rain that seemed to understand the pattern of this story. Robert Chen handed Sterling his box at the hospital's front doors. The guard's voice came quiet and absolute. "I believe you know the way out, sir." The words landed like a sentence. Like a verdict. Like a closing argument delivered in a courtroom where justice had finally decided to show up. Sterling stood in the rain, his expensive suit soaking through, his medical license suspended, his legal defense fund hemorrhaging money he no longer had access to. Behind him, the hospital's glass doors reflected nothing but the grey sky and the falling water. He walked to his car alone. Meanwhile, in the interim medical director's office on the 4th floor, Sarah Chen sat in a leather chair that faced east toward the water. Dr. Raymond Pierce, the new medical director, brought in overnight with instructions to fix what Sterling had broken, placed a folder on the desk between them. His hands were steady. His voice carried no apology, which somehow made the apology complete. The board has authorized a position, effective immediately. Director of Emergency Medicine, Norfolk Naval Hospital. Full rank restoration, military healthcare, retirement benefits calculated from your date of service. He paused. We also wanted you to know that the hospital has agreed to fund a trauma medicine fellowship in your name. The Sarah Chen Trauma Fellowship. For nurses who understand that excellence sometimes costs everything. Sarah's fingers rested on the folder. She didn't open it. Not yet. Marcus Webb wanted you to know something, Pierce continued, sliding another piece of paper across the desk. It was a note written in careful, deliberate handwriting. You taught me that strength means protecting those who can't protect themselves. Now let us protect you. Marcus's signature, formal and certain, sat at the bottom of the page. Sarah touched that signature without breaking eye contact with Pierce. By 5:48 p.m. that evening, the news broke on every Norfolk news station. Federal investigation uncovers $2.3 million healthcare fraud scheme. Dr. Sterling faces 18 charges including racketeering and retaliation against federal witness. The anchor's voice continued, 187 patients affected by unnecessary medical procedures. Former naval medical officer credited with uncovering the scheme. Criminal charges expected within 48 hours. That night, Sarah slept in a hotel room overlooking the Elizabeth River, the water dark and moving with its own purpose. She didn't dream. 6 months later, she walked through Norfolk Naval Hospital's emergency medicine department in dress uniform. The uniform fit like it had been waiting for her all these years. Her rank insignia gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the insignia of a senior chief petty officer who'd earned her place in ways that went far beyond promotion boards. The tremor in her left hand, the one that had plagued her since her second IED strike in Kandahar, was gone. Simple as that. The body sometimes releases what the mind finally permits it to release. Her office overlooked the water. Morning light caught the waves and scattered gold across her desk. On the shelf behind her, positioned where she could see it every time she looked up, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The laces were tied together. The leather bore the creases of 1,000 miles of patrol, the scuff marks of a man learning who he was meant to become. The boots had been military issue, size 11, and they'd been worn by Marcus Webb through every week of Special Forces training. A handwritten note was tucked inside the left boot, the handwriting precise, military, certain, from the boy you saved to the woman who taught me what a hero looks like. Wear these in everything you do. Marcus Webb, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Sarah touched those boots every morning before rounds. Not for luck. For remembering. For understanding that sometimes the work you do in silence echoes across decades and becomes something that saves not just a life, but a person's entire capacity to understand what their life was supposed to mean. In a strip mall parking lot in suburban Norfolk, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table outside a discount grocery store. His shirt bore an insurance company logo. His hands trembled as he handed flyers to shoppers who avoided eye contact and kept walking. The flyers promised discounted supplemental insurance policies with a coverage ceiling that actually meant very little. His medical license was permanently revoked. He faced 18 federal charges that would consume the rest of his life with lawyers and courtrooms and the particular shame of a man whose network had evaporated the moment he became a liability. A former colleague walked past the folding table, recognized him, kept walking without breaking stride. Sterling's phone rang, his lawyer, calling about the plea agreement. He answered with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The conversation took for minutes. The word 15 years appeared in that conversation. The phrase concurrent sentences meant something that Sterling had spent his entire career avoiding: accountability. Back at Norfolk Naval Hospital, Sarah led a trauma simulation for young corpsmen, sailors who'd arrived at the hospital uncertain, armed with textbooks and certifications but lacking something that couldn't be taught. She moved through the simulation with the voice of someone who'd commanded respect in places where respect was the only thing standing between chaos and catastrophe. Her hands showed them where to place the needle, how to listen for the hiss of air escaping, how to trust the data that their instruments were giving them. Her voice was steady. Her presence was absolute. Marcus Webb watched from the observation gallery in his own dress uniform, the uniform of a special forces operator, the uniform of a man whose childhood had been interrupted by war but whose life had been saved by a woman who understood that sometimes saving meant everything. He signed to a fellow operator, "That's the ghost medic. She saved me twice. Once from a collapsed building in Helmand Province. And once from thinking that heroism meant never asking for help." The final moment came on a rain-soaked afternoon. Sarah stood at the Seal Memorial Wall in Norfolk, the wall that bore the names of men and women who'd given their lives in waters that still held their memory. Her uniform was pressed. Her boots gleamed. Her hand moved across the names slowly, tracing each letter. She wasn't hiding from her past anymore. The past was no longer something she carried in secret, in the margins of her story, in the shadow of everything she did. The past was now the foundation of everything she was, a woman who'd learned that true heroism operates in silence until the moment it must roar. The camera pulled back to show her standing at full height, her shoulders squared, her hand leaving the memorial wall steady and certain as she turned and walked back toward the hospital. Back toward the work of saving lives. Back toward the work she'd always done, but this time without hiding who she was. This time, the whole world would see exactly who stood in those corridors, and exactly what she was capable of becoming when the truth finally had permission to be spoken aloud. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We tell stories about the quiet heroes, the ones whose strength reveals itself only in the moments that matter most. Let us know in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? What would you have done in Sarah's position? Share your story.